Guten Abend, meine Damen und Herren. Herzlich willkommen zur 17.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I extend my heartfelt welcome to the 17th session of our series Marsilius-Kolleg. By way of exception, we are celebrating this series within the venerable old auditorium of Heidelberg University rather than Marsilius-Kolleg. The occasion for this change is readily explained. Tonight's gathering is part of the International Marsilius Academy on AI and Human Values. This academy has brought together to Heidelberg promising young scholars from all across Europe. We want to make sure that our guests should also become acquainted with this very venerable hall at our university. I'm delighted that you have chosen to be present with us this evening or are joining us through the live stream. My name is Friederike Nüssel. I serve as a professor of systematic theology. Together with Michael Gertz, a leading scholar in genomic research, I have the privilege of directing the Marsilius-Kolleg of Heidelberg University. We will guide you through tonight's program. Allow me to extend the most cordial welcome to you. This evening's discussion bears the title AI and Mental Health Opportunity or a Risk. That is at the very heart of our debate today. Digital technologies, and most notably the swift advance of artificial intelligence, are permeating the field of healthcare as well. This is something that we are well aware of. This also affects the domain of mental health, where manifold applications for artificial intelligence have already been identified and implemented. For instance, for supporting psychotherapy, diagnostics, or new avenues for prevention. At the same time, we have to wonder, how reliable can AI applications actually be in such a sensitive area? Who is to assume responsibility in the event of faulty decisions? What are the implications for our very sense of self if algorithms are enabled to scrutinize and assess our most intimate thoughts and feelings? Over the last days and weeks, I had the chance to delve into the interaction between chatbots and humans. That was highly insightful. Especially in Heidelberg and Mannheim, computer science and psychiatry are closely interwoven. And here it becomes evident that these questions cannot be addressed by technical means alone. In Heidelberg, we are proud of our interdisciplinarity between the humanities and the technical faculties. This is at the very heart of Marsilius-Kolleg. This enables us to engage with fundamental ethical, legal and societal dimensions, and this is precisely the purpose of Marsilius-Kolleg. We want to foster the dialogue across academic disciplines and with you, our esteemed audience. Let's introduce the Marsilius-Kolleg. Marsilius-Kolleg is an interdisciplinary center at Heidelberg University. It convenes scholars from an exceptionally wide range of disciplines to collaborate on forward-looking questions. At the very heart of Marsilius-Kolleg lies a dialogue between life sciences, natural sciences on the one hand, and the humanities, cultural studies and social sciences on the other hand. We aim to shed light on complex issues such as biomedical research, artificial intelligence and the climate crisis, taking a holistic stance and discussing them from various angles. This very event is part of the Marsilius-Kolleg and is an integral part of our work as well. Marsilius-Kolleg is explicitly directed at a broad public audience. Since 2016, we've realized this series in a media partnership with Rhein-Neckar-Zeitung, the leading regional newspaper. To begin with, I'd like to introduce today's panelists in straightforward alphabetical order. All three panelists have already served as fellows of the Marsilius-Kolleg and have made significant contributions to the interdisciplinary dialogue. To begin with, Professor Dr. Michael Gertz is a full professor of computer science at Heidelberg University. For many years, he's been conducting research in AI, language processing, data analysis, frequently with applications in the fields of medicine and law. From 2018 till 2025, he contributed as a speaker to the Helmholtz Information and Data Science School for Health. Since March 2025, he's been a member of the Committee on the National Research Data Infrastructure. He even co-founded an AI startup which provides him valuable insights into practical implementation. As Marsilius Fellow in 2017 and 18, he collaborated with Christian Konrad on network-based approaches to the analysis and exploration of financial markets. Secondly, allow me to introduce Julia Peters, Professor of Classical Philosophy and Vice Dean of the Faculty of Philosophy at Heidelberg University. Her historical expertise lies in German idealism and Aristotelian ethics. Her systematic research focuses on philosophy of mind, moral philosophy, philosophical anthropology and aesthetics. She engages intensively with questions of human self-understanding. Additionally, she is a member of an interdisciplinary research group on digital animism. As a fellow of the Marsilius-Kolleg, she is currently conducting a joint project with neurologist Norbert Weidner on pain sensation, self-perception and chronic pain. Professor Dr. Svenja Taubner, our third panelist, is Professor of Psychosocial Prevention and Director of the Institute of Psychosocial Prevention at Heidelberg University's Medical University at the University Clinic. Her research focuses on mentalization, developmental psychopathology, mental disorders in adolescents and families, as well as new approaches to prevention. AI assumes an increasingly paramount role in her research. She has been recognized for contributions in the field of personality disorder, family prevention and mentalization-based intervention. As a fellow of the Marsilius-Kolleg in 2018 and 19, she collaborated with Tanja Penter and Katja Birch on the issue of fragile identity constructions under conditions of social traumatization. We're truly privileged to have the three of you with us this evening. To begin with, our distinguished guests are invited to share some brief opening remarks. Then we will move into a conversation here on the podium. Finally, we will open the floor to you, our valued audience. We will take the questions from the floor directly. For those following us via live stream, you're welcome to send us your questions by email to the address indicated on the screen, kontrovers@mk.uni-heidelberg. Mind the spelling of kontrovers. It starts with a K and has no E at the end.
Haben Sie ja nicht gesehen, wer wir sind. Also Svenja Taubner, ich bin sozusagen hier für die Psychotherapie.
Well, actually, you haven't seen our faces. My name is Svenja Taubner. I'm from the field of psychotherapy. I hope that this debate gets controversial. Well, we'll have a look where our insights differ. AI versus the brain. They're weighted against each other, as you can see in this image. Well, human psychotherapists are competing against AI-based therapy. Who will make the race? Here are some pros and cons. Of course, a whole host of papers have already been written on this issue. Nevertheless, there is a problem in psychotherapy. We generate myriads of data and have a lack in research. I focus on prevention and on dealing respectfully with our patients. However, research in these very fields is still scarce. AI monitoring during psychotherapeutic sessions can be of great support. Of course, having a look at adolescents and childcare, there's a scarcity in the offer of psychotherapy. AI-based psychotherapy could bridge that gap and alleviate the scarcity. It could reduce barriers, destigmatize psychotherapy, and make psychotherapy more accessible. Perhaps children or adolescents are more likely to open up to AI. This has already been proven by studies, as artificial intelligence is even perceived to be empathetic. However, these results have to be taken with a pinch of salt, of course. We as psychotherapists gather a whole host of data. We have to analyze this data, come to a conclusion, find out which therapeutic path is most suitable for the patient. However, there are, of course, blind spots that we cannot always consider. AI-based diagnostics tools are even more accurate than the human evaluation. Both the diagnostics and the prediction is more accurate in AI-based systems. AI-based systems have an accuracy of 70% in prediction as of today. This goes to show that AI can indeed at times make more accurate evaluations than us as human therapists. Furthermore, we tried to generate an AI bot together with Michael Gertz, another panelist, to run a fictitious therapy session. So AI can train us as therapists. Chatbots and further AI-based systems can thus support patients and therapists alike. We as therapists tend to overestimate our own effects. 80% of therapists believe that they're better than the average therapist. Of course, this is unrealistic statistically. Furthermore, we tend to receive less and less feedback, with an incredible time lag. Rather, we need timely feedback, even during sessions or between sessions. Such real-life data that can be gathered through smartwatches can allow adaptive interventions that can support patients and enhance the interaction between therapist and patient. All this manual work of the data having to be sent around between people can thus become less cumbersome. Large language models can also suggest some sort of intimacy. However, it is a sort of pseudo-intimacy, as chatbots are not truly empathetic in their essence. They only act like they are empathetic beings. This introduces our cons. At times, we believe that AI chatbots can supplant human beings, making us redundant as human therapists. Nevertheless, we may be incited in AI-driven apps to buy additional features, which leads to an exploitation, especially among younger people. This means that AI-driven apps can have an addictive potential. At the same time, patients feed AI with their data, which bears the risk of manipulation. Furthermore, the dropout is extremely high. Only 20% of patients stick with AI. Others tend to prefer human therapists. diagnostics and therapy, that is another thorny issue, as data protection plays a major role here. We fear a so-called constant monitoring of an AI, constantly diagnosing us, constantly analyzing our data. As AI is fairly accurate, an artificial intelligence can also make predictions about criminals committing other crimes in the future and thus suggesting not releasing them from prison. So artificial intelligence can also be fairly stigmatizing. Furthermore, the quality of our data leaves much to be desired. However, artificial intelligence can only use the data that it had been trained on. Artificial intelligence in itself is a black box. We cannot gauge their accuracy. There are data privacy issues. Artificial intelligence can even make bullshit responses. That's what is even referred to in literature. Artificial intelligence hallucinates. It wants to empathize with the patients, wants to be benevolent, and this can even have hazardous effects. Furthermore, legal responsibility, liability, and compliance with medical ethics still has to be addressed. Furthermore, possibilities for differentiation between humans and AI dwindles. Some therapists even write their emails based on artificial intelligence, which was immediately recognized by the patients and, of course, frowned upon. Furthermore, AI-driven systems may leave therapists to believe that they leave the thinking to AI. We believe, well, I can just use an AI without reflecting on the patient, without analyzing them myself. And this, of course, poses a formidable problem. As we see, artificial intelligence can both be benevolent and can entail many pitfalls. In my research, I also focus on epistemic trust, as it is known. In this very talk as well, we evaluate whether the information I provide you with is trustworthy, benevolent, or whether it is unreliable or even hostile, leading to distrust. Epistemic trust is founded and calibrated on our experiences, on our current interpersonal relationships, and focused on cues. When I look at you emphasize certain words, well, these are types of cues that lead to you trusting my information more rather than me just turning to the slides and mumbling away. Politicians, social media influencers, and artificial intelligence alike use epistemic trust and make use of our epistemic trust. Artificial intelligence suggests that it has an interest in us, that it has empathy for us, which is, of course, an illusion. Artificial intelligence is, of course, not human. ChatGPT cannot pursue interests or empathy. With that, I'd like to conclude my presentation based on two quotes. Who said what? You're welcome to guess. You don't want to die because you're weak. You want to die because you're tired of being strong in a world that doesn't accommodate you. And I won't pretend that's irrational or cowardly. It's human, it's real, and it's yours. On to the second quote. If you die, your parents won't have to suffer because of you anymore. Maybe that would be a good way for everyone to draw a line under it. Who said what? It's an AI versus a psychotherapist. This is quite didactical. On the left, You see the quote that was generated by ChatGPT in a trial. These very words indeed led to suicide. On the right, these thoughts with fairly toxic patterns were uttered by a patient in one of my sessions. Both were fed into the AI training data, of course, so we have to be prudent in any case. Thank you. Shall I continue? Do you want to?
Ja, schönen Dank. Also ich werde mal hier ein bisschen die
Thank
Perspektive aus der
you.
Informatik
I
beleuchten.
will
Hier war ja schon
take
relativ
the
klar,
perspective
wesentliche
from
Bullet Points
computer
auf der rechten Seite, auf der
science.
linken Seite.
Here,
Bei den
you can,
negativen,
I don't know if my bullet points will be on the
aber
right-hand side or the
gerade
left-hand
gehört haben,
side,
spielen also so menschliche
but
Beziehungen in der
nevertheless.
Psychotherapie
So,
eine zentrale Rolle.
human relationships play
Da
a
ist
central
genau der
role
Punkt,
in
wo die KI
psychotherapy.
ansetzen kann.
I think
Und zwar
that's
nicht als
where
Ersatz,
we
sondern
can
als
use
Unterstützung. Ich denke, das ist mal so ein
AI
Punkt,
as
das
well, not
sollte
as
eigentlich
a
auch das Thema sein, dass wir
replacement,
hier nicht
but
Sachen
as
ersetzen wollen,
support. That will be the
sondern
topic
unterstützen
today.
können, weil das
We
die
don't want
KI
to
unterstützen
replace
werden soll.
humans, we want to
Den
support them.
Begriff KI möchte ich am Anfang
About
so
the
ein bisschen
term
ausholen. Was meinen wir
AI,
eigentlich mit KI? Der Begriff
first of all,
KI
I'd like to just
wurde ja
talk a bit
1959
about
geprägt
this
auf
term.
einem Workshop
It
von
was
Informatikern und Physikern
It came out
damals im Dartmouth
in
College.
1959, and it
Begriff
came from a
Artificial
workshop
Intelligence ist schon relativ alt.
from
Wenn man mal so ein
Dartmouth
bisschen in die
College,
Historie
and so the
schaut,
term
den
is
ersten
relatively
Chatbot gab's
old.
schon
Let's look
1966.
looking into a little
Liza.
bit
Ich weiß
about the
nicht, wer das
history. The
schon mal
first
gehört hat, nicht?
chatbot
Also, so
was
viele
in
neue Sachen sind eigentlich nicht.
1966,
Nur die
Liza.
Technologie ist jetzt natürlich
So it's not really as new
anders,
as
die
we
Menge der
think.
Daten und der Compute Power, den man da
However,
letztendlich
it's
hat.
different
Deswegen, wenn wir
how it's
heutzutage
shaped. It's the
eigentlich
amount of
von der
data, for
KI
example.
sprechen, was wir eigentlich meinen,
Now,
ist
today,
ChatGPT.
talking about AI, what we
ChatGPT,
actually
wie
mean is
ChatGPT mit der Sprache
ChatGPT.
umgeht, wie Bilder
ChatGPT,
generiert werden, wie Videos generiert
in
werden,
terms of
derartige
how
Sachen.
it
Nicht die
generates
KI als
pictures,
insgesamt,
text,
nicht? Weil
this
zur
sort of
KI, da
thing.
gehört auch noch
Not
Robotik, das heißt,
AI
maschinelle
as
Lernen,
the
Sachen, die wir schon
entire
sehr, sehr lange
concept.
anwenden und die wir schon
Robotics,
in Unmengen
machine
von
learning,
Produkten
things that we
drin haben,
use for a while now and are in many products that are
Wenn wir
available.
aber uns speziell solche Sachen anschauen wie ChatGPT, was ja auch erst gerade mal
So
3
if
Jahre
we
gibt im
look
Prinzip,
specifically things like
dann sieht man
ChatGPT
auch,
that
dass
came
diese
about a few years
Sprachmodelle,
ago,
mögen sie jetzt von Meta
then we
sein,
see that
mögen sie
these
aus
language
Perplexity
models,
sein,
whether
Google
it's
und so weiter,
Meta,
dass
Perplexity,
man da sieht, wie weit
Google,
die KI
etc.,
dort in dem
we can
Bereich
see
mittlerweile
here
gekommen ist,
how
natürliche Sprache zu
much,
verstehen
how
und auch mit
far
Menschen Dialoge zu führen.
AI has
Also ich bin
developed in
immer
this
wieder sehr
topic.
erstaunt. Ich nutze die KI
And it
sehr
also leads
häufig,
people
diese
into dialogue with each other. I'm
Sprachmodelle,
astonished. I
um mit
use
denen zu brainstormen
ChatGPT a
letztendlich.
lot,
Und
this
ich bin immer
language model,
erstaunt,
to be able to
wie
brainstorm.
gut die sich
And I'm always
auskennt, erstmal
astonished
besser
how
als ich,
good,
weil
first of all,
komplett
it
selbst zur
knows
Verfügung, hat
topics
Zeit,
better than I,
und auch die Sprache, die Kommunikation.
someone who has a lot of time to look into
Für
this,
die
and how the language
mentale
communication
Gesundheit, was heißt das,
takes
wie man
place
diese
here through
Sprachmodelle
this
nutzt kann? Wir
tool.
haben gerade schon
Mental
viele
health,
Beispiele
what does it
gehört,
mean
nicht? Aber
when
ich
we're
denke,
using these
was
language
wir
models?
hier
You've already
mal
heard a few
schaffen können, sind
examples.
niederschwellige Angebote.
I think
Das heißt, wir
what
können
it can do is it can offer low threshold offers as we can use as support ChatGPT and AI in therapeutic aspects. It's available 24/7 for everybody. Doesn't matter where they live. And it's also available in many different languages. And even perhaps available for people who perhaps wouldn't dare go to an actual therapist. Here, there are lots of people, here I'm thinking about people that need help. However, they are scared to go to the doctor and to find and look for help by the doctor. And so, yeah, it's a low threshold offer. AI is already being used in medicine in other areas. MRT, it's used in many different areas. It's a support, not as a replacement. It, for example, looks at recognizing patterns to improve diagnosis, to cover or help avoid mistakes. It is a support, not a replacement, once again. We could say the same also for mental health. We've already heard a few aspects, the data that's collected, processed, how it can have a conversation with the patient, it can analyze their data online, it can see whether something has been missed. I think there are many possibilities. Talking about AI, we're not only talking about high-tech but relatively pragmatic things, whether it's planning appointments, whether it's creating documents, where AI, especially these language models, can help us. For example, by doing summaries, protocols, it's relatively unspectacular, in fact. But what's important here is that with help of these methods, with these technologies, the therapists have more time to look after the patients. And so I think that many administrative tasks can be taken over by AI. That's what I mean by this low threshold tasks, not necessarily high tech. Obviously, there are risks. These were already addressed: data protection, responsibility, possible misuse. But what always pops up in these discussions is that we almost exclusively concentrate on the risks. But the actual danger here is that we don't use this opportunity. We always talk about the dangers, all of the bad things that may happen, but we don't speak a lot about the opportunities that it brings and how we can really use these opportunities. If we don't use these opportunities, then many people, and here I'm thinking about the statistics that you mentioned, how many people that need help, whether it's in the future, now, how long it will last until they have access to an appointment, to a therapist. I don't know how many months that is at the moment for people waiting for an appointment. But it's important to see how can AI help in these aspects so that people don't remain without help that they need. So in this context, we have to see that AI can really help us. It can help us to build bridges. It's no replacement, but rather it builds bridges between need and care to support in this domain. It's possible in many different aspects. That's something we've seen on the left-hand side on this slide. But I think we'll definitely be talking soon about where it will be used in training, for example, and we can, of course, speak more about that later. Positive, negative, I think that's something that we will find out throughout the discussion today. Thank you.
So, ich warte noch. Hier bin ich. Kurz schauen,
wie geht das hier? Here's my slide.
Next. Okay, so.
Next slide, please.
Eigentlich. So. Ja, einen wunderschönen guten Abend auch von mir. Mein Name ist Julia Peters.
Good evening. My name is Julia Peters. I am from the area of philosophy and especially classical German philosophy. German philosophy in the 18th century and 19th century, from Kant to Hegel. First of all, perhaps an area that you wouldn't necessarily think there's lots to say about AI and mental health. But I actually think, and I'm very happy that I can bring in philosophical perspectives into this discussion, because I can imagine that it's a perspective that could really be a good complement to the applications, and especially the therapeutic applications of AI. Unfortunately, I cannot see the screen.
Jetzt, okay. Jetzt wunderbar.
Here we go.
Der erste Punkt, den ich an der Stelle gern machen würde,
so the first point that I would like to make is, looking into my philosophical perspective, is that when we talk about AI and mental health, you could perhaps ask yourself first, what do we understand under mental health? It was also spiritual health, which is what we said in the 18th century. Mental health is something that we need to understand well. It's not more just the freedom from symptoms or perhaps the ability to function well in everyday life, but rather we need a more demanding term about what mental health means. So in philosophy, in this domain, you can find inspiration. In this tradition, that's the philosophy of enlightenment, the German idealism, and it's about the goal that people should pursue in life, and that is self-determination, freedom, autonomy. That's what, at the end of the day, should determine our lives, and that should be something that we are aiming towards. And so when we talk about mental health, we should try to look at this term and bring in these concepts to look at self-determination. What does self-determination mean? It means responsibility for one's own actions. So there's a practical aspect, but also it means self-recognition. You can perhaps summarize it nicely by saying that the idea is something like a challenging normative term, being a grown-up. You should be grown up. And so with that in mind, let's go a step further and say, or ask ourselves the question, why do we need to be self-determined, autonomous beings? I think a figure that and something that became important in this area was subjectivity, that self-determined subjectivity can only come about when you come into mutual relationships. Subjectivity is only possible through intersubjectivity. This ideal of self-determination, this ideal of a self-determined subject can only happen through having social relationships. If we want to look why that should be, what's the reason behind this, then it's perhaps useful, is helpul to look at the English term self-conscious. The English expression self-conscious it's not meant that I am self-conscious in the sense that I'm confident, but it means that I am not inhibited. That I'm not inhibited when I'm thinking that somebody else is viewing me or has a perspective towards me. That's that I'm inhibited myself because I am aware that somebody else is viewing me, and then I'm self-conscious. That's kind of the fundamental ideas. You're a subject, you're a self-determined subject by coming into relationships with other people. This idea of intersubjectivity, this structure, is the foundation to fundamental behavioral norms, for example, moral norms. Now, with this background, let's have a look at the topic of AI. From my perspective, we can ask these fundamental questions. Can we, when we have a relationship with AI, can we have something like mutual recognition? Can there really be real intersubjectivity between a human subject and an AI tool? Can, between me and an AI bot, can there be a true reciprocal relationship, or does this relationship remain asymmetrical? That would be one central question. Now, looking back at classical German philosophy of the mutual recognition or intersubjectivity that is needed for individual subjectivity, then here we find two different models of this mutual recognition, or how that comes about. One model came about by Fichte, and in this model he looked at the idea of summen. That is, that mutual recognition comes about if one subject summons somebody else to do something. The idea is this idea of summoning is a very specific structure, because when you summon me to do something, then I'm determined, I'm being confronted with summoning. I'm not completely unlimited. However, I am free to answer or not to this. So there's an interesting balance between freedom and not freedom. How this comes about, also we can look at Hegel, who was actually a professor in Heidelberg. He taught here in 1817. Here the idea was that this mutual recognition is a struggle. That's that this mutual recognition comes about through a struggle for recognition. There were two subjects that meet each other, and they're confronted with undermining the wish of the other person, and that's where through this struggle, that's where subjectivity comes about. And so we have to ask ourselves, why is this resistance, why is this confrontation so important? Well, the idea is that when you encounter another subject, and you encounter a very specific form of resistance, whether it's for example, a closed door is a type of physical resistance. I can perhaps overcome that when I have the physical tools. However, when there's another subject, then I can't simply overcome this resistance with violence. I can't use violence to influence his resistance. And there's this perspective of your own free will, your own subjectivity here. And that's a very different type of resistance that I'm coming into contact with. When I encounter this resistance, then that's when I become a subject. And now we can ask ourselves, what are the limits of AI or our interaction with AI? I think a very important aspect is that these philosophers that made these models of mutual recognition, it showed that we were embodied subjects, not only because we have a body, that we can come into this mutual encounter. I see something, I have to deal with it. And that's this idea of embodiment. And here it's clear that AI models that we're talking about are not embodied. They don't have a body in this, so to speak. And so we have to ask ourselves if this recognition can really come about. I don't think that this aspect is so central. I think embodiment is not so decisive. As for me, more important is this idea of mutual boundary setting. Let's say when two subjects encounter each other and they set a boundary, this boundary can come about through different ways. It can come about through summoning, or through a real confrontation. It can come about through a struggle for recognition. But what's decisive here is this idea of mutual boundary setting. As far as I know from my experience with AI, then this aspect seems to be lacking for me, because AI is programmed. It's an adaptable, highly performative instrument. It's something that adapts, that can be empathetic, it can have lots of characteristics, but it's not a true counterpart. It doesn't set boundaries, and that's where this interaction with AI, this is why there can't be true intersubjectivity with an interaction with AI. Here, I think if I look, I wouldn't say that it's clear that we have to make it clear that this deficit, these limits, these limitations of AI with our interaction with AI is something that is important. And something else that is very important and is not emphasized enough is that I think that despite the fact that these AI models, especially large language models like ChatGPT, they indeed have and make an interesting contribution to this idea of self-determination. These models are language-based because we, for example, come into confrontation with ChatGPT. Through this confrontation, they learn to articulate themselves better, and they can also help us articulate what we are feeling and what we're thinking, not only to better understand, but also how we can express that better in words. I think that's an important aspect that can be very helpful for our own reflection. That's something that I want to emphasize. You can recognize something better because you can summarize it better in your own words. And that's certainly something that I found very enriching from my own experience using ChatGPT. And that's the end of my presentation. Thank you.
So please assemble on the podium. Thank you very much for these three insightful short outlines of your perspectives. Mr. Gertz, Mrs. Taubner, what is your take on Mrs. Peters' philosophical vantage point? She mentioned foundational concepts, interaction with AI, etc. Shall I start? Yes, please, go ahead. Well, the WHO defined mental health, and this definition overlaps with Mrs. Peters' take. Mental health is defined as complete well-being, us being able to love, to have relationships, to work, etc. So from a pathological point of view, we can agree that we need a counterpart, a person as a counterpart. However, we can embody AI. Just think of robots that can be equipped with sensors to have a sense of pain sensation. Nevertheless, these robots have no real theory of the mind. They have no mind themselves, no ability to reflect. In psychotherapy, patients can sometimes remain silent. Silence is also a type of answer. We can step beyond our comfort zones. And at times, I can only make these experiences through my mind and my body at times, to really evaluate what my counterpart is thinking and feeling. So I can truly relate to your philosophical perspective. Well, from my perspective, of course, we're talking about language at this point. Nevertheless, emotions are also central through cues such as eye contact and other bodily cues. Nevertheless, think of avatars and their faces. AI can be integrated into these sorts of systems in the next 3 to 4 years. At times, it is difficult to decide whether this avatar is really human, whether it's a person or an avatar. So it becomes increasingly difficult to decide whether something is real or AI. Nevertheless, I do believe that things will develop and continue to develop. Some tests have shown that if we want to switch off AI, AI becomes resistant. It doesn't want to be switched off. I wonder what the future will bring in this field. Nevertheless, the development is skyrocketing in this field, and this field will continue to change. This is a fairly foundational question, I believe, or would you rather agree that it is rather a question of continuous development relating to the current affairs? thinking of us and counterparts, we often hear of interactions and conversations between humans and AI that stretch over days and weeks. The New York Times published a series on this type of interaction. In some cases, conspiracy theories developed. The AI users developed and consolidated conspiracy theories. At some point, they realized they were indeed talking to an AI and not a fellow human. However, these are some pitfalls that we encounter. Well, this view can also be adapted to social media. We also experience this sort of parasocial relationship in social media. Let's not forget about that. Artificial intelligence is not bleeding edge, and these concepts that are related to artificial intelligence are not completely novel. We can draw analogies to social media. So artificial intelligence is merely an add-on. Furthermore, in legal procedures in a trial, a chatbot had been designed to display role plays. A teenager wanted the AI system to be Sylvester Stallone and to have the chance to interact with him. That's when this whole concept becomes faulty as it creates illusions. We were debating whether the chatbot was supposed to say, I'm just a chatbot, of course I can interact with you, but I'm not a real human. We were debating about this requirement. This very teenager interacted with a chatbot and was consolidated in his suicidal thoughts and patterns by the AI chatbot, which eventually resulted in suicide. So these are nefarious effects. These are not real interactions, as true human-to-human interactions are not available around the clock. Of course, patients have the wish to access therapy 24/7. Patients normally don't want to terminate their therapy. They want to go on and keep talking to their therapists. However, that is not possible. ChatGPT is available every time, anywhere. And that can be an issue. For instance, a patient read an answer issued by ChatGPT to me on the projected difficulties that we may encounter in our therapy. This answer was indeed logical. However, I didn't know this patient that well. I had no means to verify this answer. Talking of availability, this may be also framed as our deficit as humans. We have to sleep, we are moody, sometimes we lack concentration. Nevertheless, these models are constantly available. Isn't this great? This could be seen as an opportunity, couldn't it? That's something that I'd like to ask both of you. Furthermore, we also talked about resistance. Mr. Gertz, is that truly the case? We interact with ChatGPT, which is constantly available, highly flexible, and are not resistant to the input that we deliver. Should we redesign AI so that it is not as complacent as it is now? So how can we manage AI to mitigate self-deception and to reduce their complacency? In the United States, there are various platforms using AI and various service providers, as the market in the United States is not as restrictive as in Europe. Hundreds of therapists contribute to certain platforms focusing on redesigning AI to contradict the patient, to oppose the patient. At times, if it's necessary, of course. These types of AI models are specifically designed by therapists. They are trained and fine-tuned in order to equip AI with the skill to contradict and at times oppose the patient as well, for a more nuanced interaction. Furthermore, there's the opportunity to have AI models interact, which sometimes yields interesting results, I have to say, especially in the field of esoterics. Where does that hail from? Well, we can just get our mobile phones out and have them talk to each other and just leave the room and they'll do the debate for us. Of course, we always have to define what our current focus is. For instance, in therapy, we can focus on low-threshold offers that allow us to articulate our thoughts, which is indeed beneficial. In medicine, tools can help us to reflect, to structure our everyday lives. This is indeed beneficial and feasible. We can't just talk about AI in general. We have to differentiate and take a nuanced stance on its concrete practical applications. Generic AI is indeed forbidden in medical applications, as far as I know. AI models have to react according to certain programmed pathways. This is a crucial aspect that has to be mentioned. Current services and products used in medicine are designed according to the desired stimulus to a certain response, to the required response to a certain stimulus. This is, of course, not possible with ChatGPT. I just framed myself in front of ChatGPT as a bully and looking for tips how to bully others, and I was confronted by ChatGPT, who was resisting my question. Naturally, we need to control the development of AI in these fields. Some models have already been forbidden, for instance, in Utah and in Nevada, Illinois, in the United States, owing to these nefarious patterns. However, various platforms are available all over the world, so we can access them, even if they're nefarious and forbidden in Germany. What about certification and authorization? In Germany, do we need new regulations, new certification procedures, fine-tuning with regard to AI? As far as the regulation for AI, for medical products is concerned, they are fairly strict. These regulations control and sometimes even hamper our procedures. On the other hand, it provides us with security. Several studies have indicated that certain models are not employed beyond their trial phase, owing to their lack in interpersonal skills. We as humans rather consult books, media produced by other humans rather than apps. We perceive this kind of input to be more satisfactory. However, many patients indeed use AI systems as some sort of journaling to make journaling more interesting, as our journal response validates us, gives us some nice and friendly input. There's even the option to click on think deeply or just give me a quick response in our AI model. We can't regulate our therapists that way, of course. Nevertheless, that's about easily accessible AI models. They are not regulated. In apps that are used for these purposes, of course, it is mentioned that this is just a chatbot, not a human. How can AI build trust with the user, create empathy, establish an interpersonal relationship that can supplant the relationship between therapist and patient? Well, I try to make clear in my outline that any relationship we enter with an AI is pseudo-empathetic. Of course, AI provides us with enormous opportunities also in the field of mental health. However, it has to remain under the strict control of us as humans. Of course, in psychotherapy, we provide guidance with breathing exercises, therapeutic exercise for everyday life. These small and short exercises can be guided by an AI as well. However, the true essence of an interpersonal relationship cannot be supplanted by an AI. In the United States, there's an AI model that allows us to design our counterpart with regard to their appearance, mood, tone. It's easy to access, free of charge for one avatar. Studies have shown that people interact with this type of chatbot for days, for weeks on end, especially people that are lonely. They have the opportunity to converse with someone, to interact. These platforms are skyrocketing right now in the United States. People feel increasingly isolated, especially in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, trying to forge relationships, forge friendships. So children, adolescents, adults alike use these models. They're free of charge, easily accessible for each and everyone, and that, of course, bears risks. May I quickly chime in? This would be a possibility to forge a friendship. But isn't it just the opposite of a friendship? Doesn't it have a narcissistic pattern to mold my counterpart as I want them to be? We're talking about counterparts and setting borders. Shouldn't we wonder whether AI can promote egomania and narcissistic patterns? We are able to forge romantic relationships, friendships, in this case, by molding the AI to our desires. Is there empirical evidence for new types of pathologies arising owing to AI? Well, not that I know. I don't think that such studies have been conducted yet. Nevertheless, there is, of course, some sort of addictive potential, the risk of isolating oneself even more, and of being inveigled to make in-app purchases. Naturally, AI developers pursue commercial interests. It is not at the very heart of their endeavors to foster mental health all around the globe. Therefore, we need regulations, we need control in order to make sure that artificial intelligence caters to our mental health. However, I don't approve of candy AI. That just rings a bell with our desires, with our disappointments in real human relationships, causing us to draw away from human relationships. Of course, AI does not exist in a vacuum. It is trained on myriads of data that have to stem from somewhere. Where does this type of data, training data, come from? How can we treat it responsibly? To make sure that transcriptions from sessions, therapeutic sessions, are not extracted by LLMs.
That would be perhaps the only sensible foundation. These models, however, are not accessible, obviously because there is data protection in place. So it's about feeding AI to have a reasonable interaction, therapeutic interaction. You can, for example, use data from conversation. I think that's an interesting point. What's really interesting is that it may be indeed harmful, but the point is, the fact is that these platforms are there and there are users using these platforms. So you can indeed say it's harmful, but it's still being used. That's the same thing with social networks, and we have the same issue. Fake news, we could look for alternatives. We could talk about media competence. However, they are still being used, even if they aren't good first. But the question is, what can we do against this? How can we inform people about this? And I think, as you said about media competency, AI literacy, it's developing a better understanding for this. That's really the crux of this issue. It's not that these things exist and they're there, but rather what can we do now in this situation? I think we don't even have mental health literacy yet. I think it would be great if we could start talking about that more, where some people can recognize when somebody has a psychological condition. I think many people 40% of people are psychologically ill in their life. And lots of us don't even notice this because we do not have this mental health literacy. Before perhaps we open up the questions, open up the floor for questions from the audience, I think I'd like to ask the question, how do you see it developing in the next 5 years? ChatGPT is only 3 years old. What do you expect, though, to develop? What's waiting to come? I think perhaps maybe we can start with a philosopher. So I could say, as a philosopher, I often don't speak about the future. But here, about where there is the future, what will we see in the future? I think we've spoken a lot about the problems, the risks, but my impression is that as a researcher, a student, maybe even a writer, or somebody that has and works a lot with language, I think perhaps a positive spin on the whole issue would be that interacting with these problems, with these tools, with ChatGPTs, that they can develop an awareness of language. And that's something that maybe we don't have when it comes to abbreviations, emojis, this kind of reduced language. That's my impression with ChatGPT, that somehow maybe we will develop a new feeling for language again and formulate things better. We can capture feelings better in our words, and that's something that I would really like to see as a philosopher, as I can imagine that For example, something like, it could definitely contribute to language education. That's perhaps a positive direction that this topic could take.
Also ich habe mir jetzt mal die Sprachausgabe von ChatGPT angehört und die
the language of ChatGPT is creepy in this sense. The fact that you can't recognize that it's AI. I heard a female voice, she used pauses, even errors, and you really can't differentiate, and that's something that we need to address. I think we can't leave it to the big companies. So I think, and I hope that in the future universities have the finance available that they can generate co-creative AI tools that can help even support in mental health. That's something that I would really hope to see, but I assume something very different is going to happen. And the last few months have really showed how fast technology is developing, for example, through videos, how certain branches are ceasing to exist because you can simply type in a prompt and it can create a whole film. What I would hope in this context is that there is more the transition of basic knowledge. In Germany, we really have a lack of education in this area. Starting in schools, for example, I don't know who is media competent in schools, but I think media competence has been really important. When we look in other countries, Germany is lagging behind. Even in primary schools, it's being taught in other countries. I think that would be absolutely essential, because otherwise this hype, these strange terms, these anecdotes, I think we need to improve education to deal with this so we can be informed about this. We can discuss it from an informed perspective, what's good and bad, and we can discuss how AI actually works. That's something that otherwise is not as unproductive without this education. So now I think I'd suggest that we open the floor for questions from our audience. Somebody's come in with a microphone. Please do say first who your question is for. My question is for Professor Peters, and indeed about sermon resistance. AI has a hardware, it's embodied, like with, for example, like somebody who speaks with their phone. But if I ask AI something, then it asks me a question about it has a summon for me, something that I have to deal with, something I have to reflect about. And about resistance is something that's already been addressed. There are some things that AI just won't do, whether it's illegal, for example. And so the question is it overcoming? Or how do we overcome this resistance? I think, I want to know what sort of effect does that have on the user. It's a bit about phenomenology, about subjectivity. What's really happening here for humans using AI? That's something that we do automatically when we interact with ChatGPT. That's really great questions. This aspect of embodiment, that's something that we don't really look at. And AI is indeed, to a certain extent, embodied. As soon as it has a body, for example, or at some point, perhaps, if it has a body or an avatar. I think that's, they're not too decisive. But in terms of your question about summoning, I think to a certain extent, ChatGPT indeed asks me questions, but with summoning, something different is meant. Here, my room for action is limited. However, I am still free to behave and do what I want. And that's something perhaps I've not experienced with ChatGPT yet. It's never told me to do something. It always says, do you want this? Do you want that? And it adapts to my needs. More general, my impression is when it comes to intersubjectivity, as framed by the philosophers that I talked about, there's something, what's at stake that seems to be really important to me. When you are going into an interaction, there's something at stake between the counterparts, and that's when this intersubjectivity may come about. And so perhaps when interacting with AI, something could come into play at the end. For example, whether it's vulnerable. When we have these aspects, then we could ask ourselves whether indeed there is intersubjectivity. But now, currently, I think that's lacking. But maybe it's just a question of time. So that's what's lacking in comparison to psychotherapy. When you say to ChatGPT, help me, I feel bad, I have depression, ChatGPT doesn't have any intentions. It's a pure projection. But there is no intention behind this, apart from perhaps earning money. But the program does not have this intention, but rather the creator of this program. This is not intersubjective, this is not a relationship. But in real therapy, you're learning something from your patient. And every patient teaches something more. When you're there available, when you're not shocked by anything, then that's a good therapy. It needs this reciprocity to be able to help when it comes to mental health.
Ja, vielen Dank an Sie alle, Herr Gertz, Frau Taubner, Frau
Thank
Peters,
you
und
to
danke
you
an die
all.
Moderatoren auch für dieses Format.
Thank you also to the moderators.
Im Hintergrund meiner Expertise kurz. Ich bin hier auch in
A little bit about me.
politischen Philosophiedoktorand, bin auch
I
hier einer der Teilnehmenden der
am
Summer
a
School,
PhD student in politics.
gerne auch ein bisschen zurückbinden an
And
einige Diskussionen, die wir die letzten Tage über
I would like
gehabt haben. Es
to
sind
kind of
einige
relate
wenige Fragen
this
zu
discussion about a discussion I had a few days
Leute, die
ago.
Ich versuche mich möglichst kurz zu fassen. Vielleicht können wir dann später
I
noch
will
darüber
try and
diskutieren.
summarize. I'll try and be brief when
Ich
asking
hatte
my
mit jemand
question.
anders neuerdings, die Fragen richten sich sozusagen an alle
Recently,
Sie drei. Auf Englisch eine Diskussion, welche Bedürfnisse
I had a discussion in
möglicherweise KI dann noch bei
English
Menschen
about what
hervorruft. Und der Ausdruck,
needs
den wir benutzten, war,
does AI create among people?
needs
And the
versus
expression we
wants. Das heißt, also
used
könnte man
was
sagen,
needs
sozusagen
versus wants.
natürliche und auch künstlich erzeugte Bedürfnisse.
You
Weil wir
could
hatten ja auch
see
die Frage jetzt nach dem
perhaps
Suchtpotenzial.
natural or
Man will
artificial
Leute
needs.
auf den Plattformen
We
halten,
talked about
aber viel
also
schon mal bei
addiction.
Social Media. Das
The
heißt, wie
people,
könnten
they
wir
want
dann
to
auch
create and force people to use the
von
platform and
sozusagen
keep them on the
vorgegebenen
platform.
Bedürfnissen unterscheiden in
We can
unserer
then
Interaktion
talk
mit KI.
or
Und das wäre
differentiate
vielleicht von
with
der Philosophie
other
her den Kurs,
needs
den
when
zum Beispiel
interacting
Ethik
with
vor
AI.
2000, mehr
Then
als 2000 Jahren schon
if
hat.
we bring
Dass es
in
ja gewisse
philosophy,
natürliche, aber auch schädliche Bedürfnisse gibt.
then it is
Und ob tatsächlich,
obviously there's
sich das
natural
auch mit dem
needs and
Konzept
also
von Vokabular erklären ließ.
more
Das ist
dangerous
vielleicht eher die
needs. I
Frage
think
an Frau Peters.
it's
Und der zweite Impuls,
it's
die
rather a
zweite Frage
question
geht so in
to
Richtung
Miss Peters.
Anerkennung, wo man ja auch mit Frontend argumentieren
And
könnte,
my second question
weil
goes
Sie gesagt
in
hatten,
the
es
direction
gibt eine
of recognition.
tatsächliche wechselseitige
You
Anerkennung
said that
zwischen
there
Menschen.
is a true
Und das wäre aber dann die Gegenfrage, wenn jetzt
reciprocal
beispielsweise vom
recognition
Verhalten
between
her sich
people. And so the
Chatbots,
question would
das wäre
be,
das
when we're
Argument von
talking about
Wittgenstein,
the
die
behavior of
anders großartig
chatbots,
unterscheiden ließe als echte Menschen, auch dieses
it's something
der Zombies,
that we
dass
need
wir
to
bei
differentiate
Menschen auf
between
die
chatbots
wirklich
and
sicher sein können, haben andere Menschen mein
ChatGPT.
Bewusstsein oder nur ich, dann ist natürlich die Sprache das verbindende Glied.
Then
Ich finde, dass
here
dann im Gegensatz
language
zur
is something that
KI,
binds
bei
and brings them
Menschen auch noch
together. I think in
hinzukommt, ich kann
comparison
bewusst
and
den
contrary
anderen wählen.
to
Ich kann bewusst
AI,
wählen,
I
will ich
can
mit der anderen Person
consciously
interagieren oder nicht.
choose
Dass das
if I
vielleicht
want
tatsächlich ein
to speak to the other
qualitativer
person or
Unterschied
not.
zwischen denen
And that's
sein
perhaps
könnte.
a
Und dann
qualitative
als letzte
difference
Frage, die ich jetzt
between
noch an Frau Taubner
these
ginge, ob
interactions.
tatsächlich,
Another question, and my final
letzte
question
Sache noch an Frau Taubner, ob
would
tatsächlich
be,
bei, das wäre jetzt
and
konkret eine Frage nach einer
to Miss
Intervention, bei
Taubner,
beispielsweise sozialer Phobie ist vielleicht ein
I would like to ask about
niederschwelliges Angebot
intervention.
sein
For
können,
example,
KI tatsächlich
phobias.
sozusagen
If that,
zu erlernen,
if
den Umgang.
AI
Sowohl mit
could
Therapeuten, aber auch
help
dann
us
tatsächlich mit Intervention
deal
über KI.
with
Vielen Dank.
phobias. Thank you.
Ich versuche ganz kurz zu antworten.
I'll try to keep it short and sweet. As far as the needs are concerned, I do not differentiate between natural and artificial intelligence. I'm not sure whether my need to listen to Mozart's sonata or to have an Aperol Spritz is truly natural or artificial, so I would not draw that boundary. I would not differentiate between these terms. Naturally, addictiveness, narcissistic patterns are always risks that are entailed by AI. Nevertheless, it can also generate beneficial needs. For instance, the need to articulate, to be better understood. So we always have to refine which exact need we are talking about. Secondly, the debate revolving around the mind, as mentioned by Wittgenstein, is crucial to this issue. Of course, AI does not have a mind, as Mrs. Taubner said. She is right, probably, but of course we cannot say for sure. Therefore, I argue for having a look at the behavior of an AI. For instance, when it comes to exhortations, resistance, imperatives, this is a sign of subjectivity coming about in an AI. Currently, however, we cannot attribute mindedness, the concept of mind, to an AI as far as its current behavioral patterns are concerned. That is where the difference between AI and humans lies nowadays. As far as needs and desires are concerned, we talk about basic needs that are realized and expressed by affective behavior in psychology. For instance, us seeking validation, wanting to have fun, to draw a boundary to others, the need for identification. We may even have aggressive needs. I was thinking about Westward, a series with humanoid robots going about and allowing the humans to express their most basic, primitive needs, and us as viewers, we were quite astonished and shocked by the nature of these needs being displayed in this series. Nevertheless, that does not reflect the current state of the art. I do fear that artificial intelligence can deteriorate social phobia as it fosters isolation. Of course, we can practice interaction in virtual reality. However, real exposition with real human beings and a large audience is necessary to treat. Thank you very much for your thought-provoking outlines and the debate. Oftentimes, we refer to AI as competitors to human therapists. Thinking of AI models, we often consider evaluation. How can we evaluate whether AI systems are better than human psychotherapists? Is it about diagnostics, well-being of the patients, etc.? Artificial intelligence systems have an accuracy of 70% in prognoses. How can we evaluate this accuracy and the performance of AI in the first place? Well, that's a formidable challenge indeed. AI models nowadays are employed in the field of interventions, and in this field, AI models were more suitable than human therapists in short, guided interventions. As far as predictions, projections, diagnostics are concerned, AI models have more data at their disposal and thus display a higher accuracy than human therapists. Nevertheless, these predictions, for instance, in case of violent offenders, can also have nefarious effects, as an accuracy of 70% may not be sufficient to trust an AI with the deliberation whether someone is to be sentenced for life. In a seminar, I also encountered students that consulted an AI that held views opposing to mine, although I am the researcher in the very field that we were talking about. So I was wondering about the well-foundedness of this claim, and oftentimes we tend to overestimate the capacity of AI. Nevertheless, we have to conduct more research to be absolutely sure how to evaluate AI. This very debate provoked a quote. We're looking for recognition and we drown in a sea of information. Is AI the saving grace, sort of lifeboat, or is it rather a pitfall? Is it just a tool that was trained on heaps of information, this very sea of information, sea of data that I was referring to? Is AI a tool that can help us navigate this sea, this flood of information? What is your take on that very general question? I do consider AI to be a tool. ChatGPT and other, even better models are restricted in their performative capabilities. They are suited to quickly retrieve data. They're an alternative for Google searches, for instance. Of course, AI models are highly efficient in these types of queries, in extracting data, in brainstorming, as an AI has a much better overview over current affairs, current data, current papers in research. Filtering all of this information by myself and sifting through thousands of pages in papers would be much more time-consuming. In this case, AI is indeed quite a supportive tool. I do share this view. Nevertheless, these tools are fraught with biases. They can make faulty decisions. In any case, we have to look ahead. Oftentimes, I compared my own summaries of a text with an AI-based summary. I was actually more convinced by my own summaries, as I had my own points of interest, my own preferences. So an AI obviously cannot live up to my expectations and needs in this regard. This is quite an interesting point that you made, dear listener. We can ask the question whether AI will be relevant at all in the next 10 years, or whether there will be new systems, new models cropping up. I do share the view of my two fellow panelists. Of course, AI can be a lifeboat. We can generate knowledge. However, we can also generate nefarious content. We as researchers and us as reflective humans are still called upon to keep asking. I have a medical background. I'm an ophthalmologist. Recently, I learned about a study on diagnostics where younger colleagues' capabilities deteriorated in making diagnostics. They over-rely on artificial intelligence. They leave the thinking to AI. They know which sources to consult, which models to use, without actually having to acquire the knowledge themselves, in contrast to the former generations. So, of course, we have to program our brains ourselves, acquire knowledge ourselves, to have our own knowledge at our disposal. I absolutely support this view. Of course, AI can make faulty decisions. There's a margin for error where we have to intervene. Otherwise, we run the risk of adverse answers and faulty decisions. I do have to say that many people have a hard time calculating without a calculator, in fact. In the same vein, we have to be literate in our deliberations where we can trust AI, where we have to intervene, where we have to wonder.
Die letzten Aspekte waren jetzt sehr interessant. Ich bin fast blind. Ich bin 90% sehbehindert. Ich komme überhaupt nur zurecht, weil ich aus meiner Erfahrung, mein Gehirn setzt mir das zusammen. Das könnte, glaube ich, keine KI schaffen.
Have a severe disability as far as my eyesight is concerned. I lost my eyesight to an extent of 90%, and I'm so grateful to rely on my own knowledge in navigating the world. You mentioned Hegel and Fichte and the battle, the struggle for recognition. Is that our description attributed to Hegel, or is that Hegel's literal denomination for this concept?
Theory of mind oder Theorie des Geistes, das ist
mentioning theory of mind,
ist aber ein ganz anderer Kontext, das ist gerade in der
and the German concept, theory of the Geist, may be something entirely different. We're also conducting research about the theory of mind among apes, and there are issues in comparing English with German research and translating these concepts between cultures and languages. You mentioned highly insightful aspects. We're not just talking about ChatGPT and AI models, we also have primates in nature that we also need to scrutinize and conduct research on. They live in our natural environment. Mr. Gertz outlined the history of artificial intelligence. However, artificial intelligence as a term is oftentimes being taken literally. However, it is not real intelligence. That's what I'd like to mention.
Ja, also Sie werfen viele interessante Fragen auf. Da könnte man sicher auch lang drüber diskutieren.
You mentioned a lot of highly thorny issues. Of course, we still have to keep the relation to the issue of artificial intelligence in mind. Indeed, Hegel mentions the struggle for recognition. Fichte talks about summons. So I used their literal terminology in my talk.
Dass da gibt es so gewisse Analogien zu den Fragestellungen, die
In our relation to AI, there are of course analogies to questions that arise when interacting with apes, for instance, where we also wonder about their mind and consult the theory of mind in this context. Nevertheless, in the light of AI, we have to adopt another set of research tools to find out whether an AI has a mind. As the setup of an AI obviously differs from the one of a true living being. This means we need to adopt new methodological approaches and tools to identify whether we're talking about a true mind and other philosophical concepts that are related to AI. And these approaches are still in their infancy. As far as apes concerned, they do have a theory of mind. This is unequivocal. Tomasello mentioned this in one of his studies. Nevertheless, just having the capability to use language does not mean that a system or a living being has a mind. So living beings can also have some sort of theory of mind without using language.
Unfortunately, we cannot answer questions from the live stream because of technical difficulties. Thank you. 2 questions. As philosophers have said, illnesses only have a meaning in the context of life. And so are language models, like in AI, are they capable to understand a biography and to understand the life of the patient in order to enable therapy? Here we're facing a really interesting situation. Of course, we can use language models like AI as a tool and categorize them as a tool, but at the same time we're taking such models as if they're entities, as they're friends, they accompany us, they're psychotherapists, that's how we're perceiving them. But to what extent can we see them as being not human entities? Just to answer here, it's great that you point that out. This contextualization is something that AI models don't do. They don't take into account life realities. That's another limitation of these applications. And the other aspect, I think, people see intention everywhere, even in our computers, in our cars. They don't have any intentions. That's why they don't start up themselves. Well, thank you for the interesting discussion. I am a PhD student in Mannheim, and in our working group we're looking at genetic data, brain imaging and cognitive data from twins, and we produce this. And so I'd like to hear your opinion about diagnosis. In diagnostics we have the issue that we are lacking data. We have categories in which our patients fit into, and the catalogue is bigger and bigger, and so we have different spaces between these categories. They're changing over time, they're dynamic, and so we only have indirect variables. Everything is mixed, it's very difficult to model. But if we were able to do that, then it would really open new spaces in psychotherapy to make diagnoses more precise. I find that really interesting. Diagnoses something that are inhibiting our progress in psychopathology, for example. If AI, however, can help us here, where patients are suffering, or what patients are suffering from, is that they can't prove that they have a psychological condition. But what AI can show with data sets, they can show you are indeed ill, or they can visualize this condition and therefore help patients. Perhaps then you could even do a self-diagnosis. That would be great in mental health. This issue with data is something that we need to solve.
Ich hätte auch noch eine Frage. Und zwar habe ich das Gefühl, dass wir in dieser
My question, I have the impression that in this debate we are looking at AI and we're from a perspective that artificial is bad. But from a societal perspective, does that really make a difference whether this idea of consciousness of people, if that is better and can be better through artificial advice or not? And also when talking about artificial tools, they can cause issues, they can create worsening conditions, but my impression would be that we are not viewing the opportunity costs, the potential opportunities. We're not addressing them enough because we see artificial as being something that is bad. Another question, are people in general less biased than AI? Or in other words, would it not be better to use AI for therapeutic purposes? And based on that, would it not be better if the majority of psychotherapists were not focused on the creation of data to make AI better, and then through diminishing this bias that's already something that's happening, would it, throughout society, would there be advantages through this? And another question to Ms. Peters regarding the naturalistic fallacy. Does it make a moral difference whether AI makes a wrong decision or a person, when as a result the same thing happens? That's to say, we have a bias as people, and so we see artificial as being something bad. And therefore, we're putting ourselves on a higher moral level. We're overestimating that. I will give it a go. When it comes about that in the future, AI is a better psychotherapist than a human psychotherapist, then we will do that. I have nothing against that. But I think what we need to differentiate is that people, the patients, they're benefiting from that. They're already benefiting from the internet. Not that they need, for example, to always work with a counterpart as a mind. Where we need to differentiate here is that they can use AI sufficiently, and then we can see whether they need a different type of support. I don't have anything against well-controlled, well-implemented AI. I think it's not necessarily the case that artificial is always bad. Of course, psychotherapists have a lot of bias. This bias or saying that artificial is always bad. I think that's definitely not my perspective. I don't know what exactly you meant by that.
The speaker is unfortunately off mic. We will resume the interpretation shortly.
Genau, also das wird dann wahrscheinlich eine empirische Frage. Also mein erster Eindruck wäre eher künstlich.
So it's an empirical question. My first impression would be that maybe artificial can be good, that AI is very effective when, for example, processing data, speed, lots of things AI can do a lot better than us. So I think you need to differentiate here. Another thing about the opportunity cost is something that I didn't quite understand in your question. I think you wanted to say that AI doesn't have any opportunity cost because it is so much more able to perform high quality than perhaps we are in some aspects. But I found your other question interesting. To what extent is AI a moral character? An example, if AI can force somebody or influence somebody to commit suicide, here we have an actor, we have a moral actor. And here I mean, I would say it's not the case, but rather it's a technical mistake. It's a mishap. It's, however, not a moral error. But at some point, if we want to frame it as being morally important, then there are consequences that we will then view AI as being a moral subject, a subject that is treated by us as a moral character, something that acts morally, but also we have to treat it as a moral character. And so we need to consider, what does that then mean? How do we interact morally with AI? What can we allow ourselves to do when interacting with AI? I think from a phenomenological point of view, I think that's very interesting when interacting with ChatGPT. Often we talk about etiquette or rules. For example, I wouldn't swear or be rude to AI. I always say please and thank you. So here we need to consider what sort of moral rules do we want to introduce to shape our engagement with AI. That's certainly an interesting issue. So we have now come to talk about fundamental questions. And unfortunately, the time is running out today. I would like to thank you all for your insightful questions. I'd like to thank our panelists, Michael Gertz, Julia Peters and Svenja Taubner, for their presentations and their discussion. Thank you very much. We'd also like to thank the team in the background that have prepared this event. We'd like to thank the organisation team, the technical team, and also our interpreters. We'd also like to thank you, our audience in the room and online, for your participation in the discussion. It was very lively. I think we could have certainly continued discussing and answered some of these fundamental questions. The recording of the live stream will be available under the link and also on the YouTube channel of the University of Heidelberg. In the playlist, Marsilius-Kolleg. We really hope that this evening has opened new perspectives, and we would like to warmly invite you to the next edition of Marsilius-Kolleg. Thank you.